Great. Well, welcome everyone. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I'm Mark Fowler. I'm the Deputy CEO at Tanenbaum. Thank you all so much for joining us. Um, just for those of you who may be unfamiliar with us, Tanenbaum is a secular, non-sectarian, not-for-profit. Our mission is to combat religious prejudice with the vision of a world where differences are respected. And we recognize in our work that we do believe differently and we do think about things differently. But we believe also that the ways in which we differ and come to understand one another can be done with civility and respect. And so in the four program areas in which we work, our mission and our goal, and in this instance, our work with our corporate partners, educational partners, healthcare partners, and our peacemakers is really around creating a world where there are models of engagement that have as respect and civility their foundation. And I also want to take a moment to just acknowledge for all of you, for anyone who is being directly impacted by COVID-19 in some way, whether it is either yourself or someone that you know or love, or you are connected to a first responder or a teacher or anyone who is on the front lines dealing with this. We just want to say that our thoughts and prayers go with you and with all of them, that we have all been called to new ways of living and being in the midst of this pandemic. And we want to give you our warm and heartfelt thoughts that everything will be okay. That said, I would like to introduce our interviewee for the day, a dear friend and colleague for many years, Hyun. So I do want to say a couple of things about Jane professionally, but the thing I want to say the most and that I would want you all to know is that she is one of the most thoughtful people that I've ever had the good pleasure to work with. And she also is one of the kindest people that I know. In addition to those, it's true. And in addition to that, you know, professionally, Jane is the founder and president of Hyun and Associates. They are strategists in global leadership. Jane draws upon 25 years of experience navigating organizational change in very high stakes environments. She's had executive posts at JP Morgan Chase and Deloitte and other organizations. She's the author of the groundbreaking bestseller, Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, Career Strategies for Asians, and her most recent book, Flex, the new playbook for managing across differences, examines the skill of switching between communication and cultural styles to leverage the power of difference. Jane is the recipient of the Marshall Goldsmith 50 Leading Global Coaches Award as the #1 coach for cultural fluency. And her life's mission is to help people flourish in their workplaces and in their communities. So please, if you would help me virtually welcome Jane to this conversation. Jane, it's so good to see you.
Thank you, Mark.
Taking the time to be with us.
Oh, it's a real joy to be here with you, Mark, and I look forward to the day we can actually do it in person and continue this conversation. And I think this dialogue and the topic that you've selected around culture and being cross-cultural allies is so critical. It couldn't be more timely. So I really look forward to unpacking this with you and the group that have dialed in.
That's fantastic. Welcome and thank you. I thought it would be good if we started though, if you would just tell everyone a little bit more about Hyun and Associates so they know a little bit more about the work that you do.
Sure. So welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to meet many of you. I know some of the names, I recognize some of them on the call. Our organization helps to close culture gaps in organizations. And so often culture is, as Geert Hofstede defined it, it's the software of the mind. It's the unwritten rules that were taught to you from a very early age. It defines how you'll be rewarded and what kind of behaviors are kind of reinforced in that system you grew up in. And culture is really difficult to spot, right? In organizations, people don't always understand when culture is at play in manager-employee dynamics or in teams or in business conversations. But behaviors are not difficult to spot, right? So we help sort of people understand this sort of visible and invisible aspect of culture so we can figure out how to help organizations work more effectively together. I think what I've observed quite a bit in the last 15, 20 years of doing this work within organizations as a consultant is that often, diversity, I think a lot of times companies see that when they've reached diversity or they feel like they've diversified more than they've had, that they've kind of done it. But they forget about the inclusion part or building the skills in managers and leaders to be, to help them create that environment where the diverse populations of people they brought in, regardless of what that diversity is, that they can thrive. So we help that part of that, right? We help the intangible part of that and help organizations to create that. So it's a journey, right? That work is not overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen in one setting. And so we work to partner with organizations to build that over time and help individuals become more effective at it as well.
That's great, Jane. Thank you so much. One of the things that you said
Sure.
that I thought was so brilliant, even in the beginning, you're shining already. This idea where you may not be able to see culture, but you can see behavior. And, that is certainly one of the tenets that we work with at Tanenbaum, particularly around religion in the workplace, that you cannot manage people's beliefs, but you certainly can manage behavior and set clear expectations for managing those differences and managing the behavior that people have around differences. So I think that that's really a great point to start with.
Absolutely. And I know, with the kind of issues and challenges you guys interact with in companies and hospitals and healthcare systems and schools, I mean, sometimes the kind of issues you encounter are very blatant, right? In others, not so much, right? And so I think there's an interesting intersection that we need to explore that looks at what's causing some of this, right? What are some misperceptions? What are some assumptions that people have that get at some deeply seated beliefs and value systems that need to be explored? So I'm fascinated by this, and I think this is the beginning of a conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I do think that we're all in the space of, just in diversity, equity, and inclusion work and all of the related work by those represented on the webinar today. We're always learning. It's a constant, I feel sometimes just like one of those ballerinas in a music box, like we're pivoting all the time, just trying to find the next direction to move in the work that we're all doing. Excuse me, given
Absolutely.
that, I'd like to, I guess, pivot a little bit and discuss a little bit what's happening in current events. We know that there are rising incidents of anti-Asian bias that are occurring as a result of xenophobia in response to the global pandemic. And I'd like to take a minute just for the purposes of our conversation today to give a little definition to xenophobia. We're talking today very specifically about the fear of foreigners or of anything that is strange or foreign. So when we're talking about xenophobia and looking at it specifically around the rising incidence of anti-Asian bias, we are talking about the experience that people have of people who are or are perceived to be Asian as foreigners, or that somehow they are strange or foreign in some way. And I guess starting with that as a definition, what are some of the things that you're seeing?
I really appreciate the definition because when I first saw the description of the session, I thought, okay, xenophobia, anti-Asian bias, and all of this. I kind of knew generally what that was, but it was great to hear you define it in that very specific way. You know this. COVID-19 and the lockdown is happening to all of us. You know, we're all impacted by this in so many different ways. And we're remote working, we're figuring out ways to get our food, we're dealing with kids at home. There's so many different things we've had to pivot and adjust to, like you said, Mark. And I think for this situation, as it impacts Asian Americans here, you know, I think it's important to pause and reflect and think about how it's hitting the different communities, right? And I think it's hitting the different communities in a variety of different ways. And what I'm hearing is just a lot of kind of fear and actual incidents of bias toward Asian Americans. And I tell you, it was sort of this theoretical thing until I realized it kind of was like making me afraid as well. So the kind of things that I'm hearing, and that I'm sure many of you heard as well, is the story of a middle school student in Southern California whose teacher didn't step in to protect him when his peers were making fun of him because he was coughing. And I think they were saying you have the virus, and they were kind of shunning him in class, and the teacher didn't do anything. But anybody that outsiders deem to be Chinese, so these are Filipino, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, Thai, and probably other ethnicities as well, who are experiencing the sting of patients who refuse to be treated by them, who they want to help, right? They're risking their lives to actually help them and treat them. They're being rejected, they're being blamed for bringing the virus. And if folks are interested at the end, when we give resources, maybe a week or so, we could send some resources. There's a wonderful video developed by some of these healthcare workers that point to kind of the fact that, you know, I'm not a virus, and it's important that you treat me, you know, as a person. I just heard about a young man who got punched in the stomach coming out of a subway. I think the list goes on, and I think in Brooklyn there was a woman who got acid put on her face when she was trying to take out the garbage. Yeah, I think it happened just a week ago or so. So these incidents are happening, and there are now resources to log some of this stuff. But I also think there are incidents that are happening that are not reported, that I don't even hear about and know about because of some of the cultural factors as well. So it's very troubling. It's scary. And, you know, I tell you, sometimes I'm afraid to go outside myself, you know, without, you know, my son, or, you know, walking out with somebody to make sure that there's no hint of any kind of harassment that I might get. So I think it's really hitting home.
Wow, thank you so much, James. You know, they are called bias incidents, but it's also quite violent, the things that you're talking about. And they're not, it's the escalation of words being said to actual physical engagement as well. So there's this spectrum of bias and violence that that the community is experiencing. Something that you said made me think, so I guess a little bit of a two-part question. One is, what are some of the things that your client or particular issues that people are approaching you about today, given the impacts of COVID-19 on workplaces and all of the various different pivots that we need to make? But I also would be curious to find out, so you talked a little bit about the potential for underreporting, and we certainly see that in religious communities as well, that, you know, because of a intersecting factors, people may not often go to the police or make a formal complaint about something that's happened to them. And I wonder if you could just talk about that as well in terms of workplace experiences and perhaps those factors that might be impacting people who may be being interacted with their colleagues in a potentially negative way. So I'd just like to hear you speak about those things.
Yeah. So I think those are a couple of pieces there. I want to start out with maybe some assumptions that people make or commonly hear that are made about Asian Americans. And I think it's important for me to kind of say this disclaimer in that Asia is not a country, right? You know, it's a continent, you know, filled with lots of countries. So when I refer to Asian Americans, it's a very broad swath of the population. And these incidents have not been only happening to one group of Asian Americans, but I just wanted to make that clear. It's a very broad term to use for only, I think, 6.5% of the population, right, as well. So I think the first assumption that I think is important to think about and address about Asian Americans is a sort of the concept of the perpetual foreigner syndrome.
Jane, hold on one second. So, Jane, I'm sorry, someone said that
Yes.
you're muted and that they can't hear you.
Oh, that's not good. Let's see. That wouldn't help. How is it
Okay,
now?
okay, you're back.
Okay. I'm going to just
Yep, you're
hold
back.
the
You're fine.
microphone close to my mouth. Maybe that helps. Okay. Great, great. So one of the assumptions that I want to address first before we get into some of the cultural aspects is this concept of the perpetual foreigner, right? Kind of this stranger in your own land. And I think it's a concept that hits close to home for almost every Asian American that I know, that we've kind of gotten the term of, well, where are you from, right? Where are you really from? And then when you tell them where you live or whatever it is, they're kind of like, no, like where are you really from? Like your ancestors, your tribe or your people. And this concept that, even if you've been born here or been naturalized and maybe even third or fourth generation, that because you look a certain way that you're considered an outsider. And I think it's that kind of perpetual foreigner syndrome combined with kind of this otherness, right? That they don't exactly know where you're from. And so I think that's creating also these acts of bias that are happening to all sorts of different Asian communities that may or may not be Chinese, right? It's misplaced anyway to make fun of any group, but it's happening to a lot of different groups. So this perpetual foreigner concept, I have to tell you, younger in my life, I had colleagues who would tell me, you know what, I don't really see you as Asian. And that concept of, and what is in that comment, right? It's meant to be a compliment. It's meant to be saying that, I consider you a friend and you're kind of part of us. But deep inside, the first time I heard that, I was thinking, but I'm proud to be Asian, right? Like, I'm happy to be Korean American and to operate in this society as a Korean and as an American, as having these very distinct identities that I hold very dearly. And so it's that concept of it's not good to be foreign, right? It's sort of this other thing, and we want you to be assimilated into this one way. So that's a whole nother topic. The one concept of culture or cultural trait of Asians that I want to get across is, you mentioned sort of not reporting or the hesitancy of reporting. There's a concept, when I wrote Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, I want to talk a lot about one of the major differences that people see in the workplace is the concept of the loudest duck gets shot, right? It's a Chinese proverb. And what does that mean?
The loudest
right?
duck.
The loudest duck gets shot. The loudest duck gets shot. And it basically is kind of implying that, it's not good to make waves, not good to be too different or stand out too much, because you're sort of like, creating negative attention to yourself, and it goes against kind of this group and collective mindset. And so it makes it reluctant for an individual to say something, even if it's something that's happening. The other concept of it is, which is more of an American saying, is I'm sure you can guess, right? The squeaky wheel gets the oil, or the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And what does that say, right? What does that mean? It means if you've got something to say that's different from what other people are saying, you better speak up. Right? You have to say something about it. Otherwise, you can't change things. You can't make something happen. And it's a very, very emblematic of an individual way of being, that you can change things if you say something, and it's there. So I think those proverbs to me are so different from each other, and it requires, let's say for an Asian person to say, wow, I think I need to speak up, right? I think I need to say something. It does require going out of their comfort zone to make that happen. And so it's interesting to see, I think there's something like, in the websites that have been tracking some of these incidents, there have been over 1,600 incidents that have been reported. And then that's actually pretty good, right? And I imagine if there are people who are reporting outside of that, that haven't actually put it out on the website, there's going to be a lot more. So those are the dynamics that I thought I would paint for you, because I think it's important to understand what's going on and how it's impacting the community.
It's so important, Jane, because, perpetual foreigner syndrome is certainly a dynamic of that we see definitely within our work around religious diversity in the workplace. That people who, particularly with Islamophobia, we see that with people who are perceived to be Muslim or identify themselves as Muslim, they may both experience being foreign in terms of an assumption that they were not born in the United States, and an assumption that they have religious beliefs that are different from the person who's addressing them. And you know,
Right.
that whole dynamic of "I don't see you as Asian" is so ingrained in this, ingrained in an idea of normalcy, of what is normal, and that, you know, and
Yeah.
who is other and who is different. So I think that those are really grounding principles that you've shared, that we can look at the applicability of across a variety of identifiers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you know, for Asian Americans, particularly in companies, organizations where you might have ERGs, you know, oftentimes they may not be speaking up about these issues in a loud and broadcast way to leadership. And so they probably assume that they're doing okay. When in reality, you know, back at home or maybe even in the workplace, they do feel like these issues are becoming a bigger deal. So I think it's helpful to really listen intently through the ERG groups or through other folks to more deeply understand what's going on in the community.
Yeah, I think, and I want to just piggyback on something that you say, that because I think I shared with you as we were doing prep. At one point, I was a public high school teacher here in New York City, and pretty early in my career, I remember attending a workshop where they were talking about the percentages of Asian students in the New York public school system that were underperforming. And it was somewhere around 15 or 20%. And one of the dynamics that they spoke about was that often those students that needed attention or needed additional help were not getting it, and teachers were not approaching them because of the assumption and the stereotype that they were going to be fine, that they are good students and they're going to do what they need to do. And so there was this gap between the actual experience and the productivity of the students and those who were evaluating them. So I think that there may be something to say as well, is that not just waiting for reports from the ERG in your company, but actually going to the ERG leaders and going to the ERG itself and asking, you know, is there anything that that you would like to share with us that leadership needs to know to support your experience here? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that obviously organizations all have different structures in place, and sometimes ERGs are very new. They may not be equipped to have those types of feedback sessions or listening sessions set up. Absolutely, I think that ERGs can be a tremendous resource. I just find that sometimes they're under-resourced. And if a case is not made for supporting a certain group or really providing resources to a certain group, it becomes kind of like they want to, you know, boil the ocean, but then they get no budget, right? And they can't make this happen in that way. I do think ERGs are really powerful resources for organizations if they can be leveraged. Yeah.
That's great. Well, so much of your work is around building bridges with different cultural communities and developing cultural fluency and proficiency, I would say, from what I've seen of your work. How do you think we can be more effective at building bridges with different cultural communities with our workplaces? And let's start there. What are some of the things you think that we can be doing?
Yeah, well, you know, there are things that leaders can do individually, and then there are things that the organization can do, right? And I think it comes down to really focusing on managers and leaders to help them be more effective with people who are different from them. So if you have an organization and you value development in people, that's a start. And then on an individual level, just anybody listening in can hear this, is, you know, just remaining curious. When you have a diverse workforce, you know, that constant state of learning and wanting to know and hear about other folks and other ways of being, I think that really helps. A lot of organizations have innovation, you know, as a value. You can only become innovative if you understand various approaches to doing things. You don't want to be stuck in one rigid way of thinking and doing. That's another way of thinking as well. I think it starts with yourself. So if I could leave kind of one practical tool or tip that could be used, one of the things that I offer when we do coaching around becoming more culturally fluent as a leader is something I call pre-engagement questions. And so I think in most organizations, managers need to give feedback or performance reviews or intermittent have conversations with them about how they're doing, right? Status meetings and that kind of thing. I think that's a tremendous opportunity to really have a one-on-one with your team member. And what I find is that when people give feedback, whether it's about behaviors or just kind of say something after a meeting about how it went, they don't always think about how their lenses may impact their perception of the other, right? And particularly if that other is someone from a different cultural community, if the person's female, if the person's younger or older. I think there's so many different differences that exist there. It's not just cultural, right? There's a lot of different ways of being effective. But as all leaders do, you know, they come from their own perspective of this is what's effective, it's worked for me, and it's going to work, right? And so when they see behaviors that are not exactly like how they would do it, they often come to the conclusion that it's not going to work, or they judge it. And I think it's important before we come to that place that we really look upon ourselves and take that moment to self-reflect. And so the 3 pre-engagement questions are, 1, you know, what are they thinking? What could be going on behind this behavior? Is it personality? Is it culture? Is it having a bad day? It could be all of those things. You know, 2, how do I connect? Right? How do I break the ice and begin that conversation? You know, do I have enough of a rapport with them to really give them feedback? Do I want to engage in that in a more effective way? And then 3, how do I show empathy and put myself in the other person's shoes before I even open my mouth? And so I encourage them to have this reflective moment and have this conversation with themselves just for 5 minutes, and then jot down on a piece of paper or a journal the kind of thoughts that come to them. And I guarantee all the folks that I talk to who have started to practice this, when they have had those conversations or feedback to others and just an open dialogue about how to work better together, their conversations have gone much better. They're not judgmental, they're more thoughtful, they're more curious. They lead with a question, right? Versus, you know, you did it terribly, right? Like, that's not the way to do it. You know, there's a sense of listening that's involved in that. So, you know, I give that to you as a helpful tip for engaging across differences in a variety of settings.
And Jane, could you just repeat them, the 3 questions, one more time? And
sure.
Sujata, could I ask you just to put them into the chat box for everyone?
That would be great. That would be great, Sujata, because I don't know if I could type and talk at the same time. Sure. The first one is, what are they thinking?
What are they thinking?
Mm-hmm. Which gets into what could be driving this, right? And it's not just how I think of things, but there could be a lot of other factors. So that's 1. 2, how can I connect?
How can I connect?
Mm-hmm. And 3, how do I put myself in the other person's shoes and show empathy?
How do I put myself in the other person's shoes and show empathy?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
yeah.
So I'm imagining myself, and I'm, you know, preparing to, let's say, I'm preparing just to have a team meeting. Like, and here we are in the midst of COVID. I'm preparing to have a team meeting, and I use these 3 questions. So how do you think that might be able to develop my skills as a culturally fluent leader? As I'm, you know, starting a remote meeting with people all over, even if they're in the same town or the same city, they're all at home, they're sequestered. How does this help me actually manage the work experience that people are going through?
You know, there's so many factors that come into remote meetings, and we could probably have a whole discussion on that, and discuss and peel back the onion of all the different elements of communication that actually can help in some cases, but also break down when you're in this virtual type sort of setting, and the different dynamics that it creates. I think asking yourself those 3 questions, in addition to learning more about other cultures and other backgrounds and other styles, will give you a pause before you make any kind of a judgment. And I think the biggest thing we need to understand is another person's way of communicating or resolving an issue or making a decision is not necessarily wrong, right? It may be just different. And you need to kind of discuss that with that person. And I think having these types of questions as a resource before you engage in that dialogue will give you that openness to learn from that other perspective, you know, and understand from that other person's point of view. When you have remote meetings, for example, one of the things that comes up probably is making sure that you hear everybody's voice, right? When you've got 10 people on a call from 3 different locations, you've got to make sure everybody's input is there. You know, how do you make that work? And then do you have folks who are introverted and extroverted? Do you have folks who are more direct or indirect in their communication style? If they disagree with something, how will they communicate? How will you have pre-meetings maybe and post-meetings to debrief what's going on? How will you make sure everybody's voice is heard? Even if they don't want to speak at every public setting, how will you get their voices to be heard as well? So I think it's having conversations with the people on your team, apart from those public sessions, to understand them better, right? And really focusing on feedback and coaching that will get at that. There's no way you can skip those steps in order to engage with your employees. And I think often when we're busy, we do, right? we don't have the time. And we sort of kind of figure people just understand things and we just move on. And then when we have conflicts, then things start to unravel and we realize some of these dynamics are going on.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is a really important point because it also takes us back to our original conversation and some of the original thoughts about, you know, so what's normal now and who's normal? And, you know, we're all in a place where we don't always know exactly what people are up against sequestered in their homes during a stay-at-home order or this pause. And we can kind of imagine what people are dealing with, but we don't know for sure. And I think that the questions that you've posed, and both for self-reflection, but potentially also for sharing and team building and development, gives some space for people to maybe talk about the things that they're really up against, that may be interrupting their ability to be productive. I know for myself, working at home and on days when I have like multiple Zoom calls, one right after the other, by the time the last call, all I can do is just lay on the couch for a minute because I've just been.
Oh yeah.
And it's
I hear you. I hear you.
I mean, interestingly enough, you know, I may have a 40 or 45-minute subway ride that I take home, and that becomes kind of like my decompression time. But now I don't have that. So all I do is kind of, the couch is over there. I kind of fall onto the couch for 15 minutes at least, just to kind of pull myself together. So never mind what everybody else might be dealing with. So I think that these can be really, really useful, both for that personal introspection, but also to create space for people to actually talk about what's going on for them.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So there's a huge body of work around allyship. And I think that it's important for us to talk about, and I'd love to get your thoughts about, what can we be doing now to become more effective and supportive advocates for people in our organizations, and particularly for our Asian colleagues, because to your point, there may be underreporting of, and you know, just imagine that person that experiences something when they're trying to go to the grocery store or, you know, do a basic errand or go to take care of a parent. That may not necessarily be something that they share in the team meeting, but the behavior may seem off. So I just wonder if you could share a little bit about what are some of the things we could be doing now to be effective and supportive advocates to really develop our ally skills.
Yeah, I agree with you that there definitely is probably underreporting or the concerns that Asian Americans have in the workplace are just not spoken about. You know, I can tell you when I first wrote my book, the bamboozling book, I was aware, even from my own corporate experience, that Asians were just not part of the diversity conversation. You know, it was just not at the table that they had any challenges in the traditional ways of thinking about it. And, you know, to be honest with you, when I started to go to organizations to speak there, they're kind of like, oh, I didn't know, you know, I didn't know that there was this, you know, ceiling and that they had challenges in their careers. I think that's still the case in some ways, right? Because of all these different dynamics that are going on. And then the media gives you all these different reports of Asians doing well in math and high rates of graduation from colleges and all that. And so you assume that they don't have any needs, right? They don't have any resources. So I do think that that could be happening. I think what I'm hearing, what I think could be done in organizations could be, I think it really depends on the company or nonprofit or school, depending on the organization. I think it's really identifying what's happening and how much they're experiencing this. And if you have an Asian resource group of some sort, really getting them together, telling them that this is important to the leadership of the company, and saying, we'd love to have a listening session with you, right? And just really listen to what's going on. They don't have to have solutions at this point, but hear them out. Whether it's happening at home, happening, well, everybody's home, I guess. So it's happening at home, or when they're on the street to get their groceries or pick up their necessities. Where are you facing that? And if it's something they're facing in the workplace, they should definitely report that, right? That should be something that's there. Encouraging them to speak up, but providing them that confidentiality, and perhaps a neutral place where they can go and report this, and making that very clear. I think that would be really, really important for them. And assurance that, it's not going to jeopardize their jobs if they speak up. It's not going to hurt their chances of keeping their jobs or getting promoted, if they were up for that in the future. Those types of things, I think, are probably fears. I think I'm hearing of, and I think we talked about this yesterday, Mark, that some organizations are having their leaders communicate kind of a no tolerance policy for any kind of bias or insensitive language or bullying of any sort in the company. And I think that's probably smart. I don't think that's a bad idea. Even if it's something that's not happening in the company, if it's happening outside and they're experiencing it, or their friends or family are experiencing it, it's something that's on their minds, and it's probably not. There's no harm in it, right? There's nothing that's going to harm the company by sending out communications like that. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of some organizations in your membership even that have responded to this with some action or some support from the leadership. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple of companies that have, and a lot of the communications have both been internal, and we all also recommend this, unfortunately, when there are acts of violence against religious communities, for instance, Tree of Life Synagogue massacre and those kinds of things. It really is an opportunity for the senior leadership, particularly the C-suite, to reinforce, at least within the company, and to their shareholders and their customers, the company's strong foundation and belief in equity and fair treatment. And so, yes, we definitely see that as well.
Absolutely. I think to a certain degree, some of the global companies have almost been prepared for it because they saw it happen in Europe and Asia, right? So their offices over there, they've been locked down for a couple months, and they've been kind of a little more prepared to deal with it. But, apart from being a global company, even in the U.S., you've got so many multicultural communities here. There's no reason for you to not be aware of and to communicate proactively on these aspects. So,
great.
So it's never too late.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so we're going to open this up for questions in just one moment. I just want to add one thing, I think, to the conversation about being an ally. We talk about being a bystander, being an upstander, and some of the dynamics of being an ally. And there are any number of ways in which we can be an ally, but I think the big takeaway that I would like to leave everyone with is to find a way to be an ally. I think that a lot of what you've shared today, Jane, and some of the examples that you've shared, there's almost not an identity group that I can think of that has not in some way, not necessarily under COVID-19, but has not experienced in some way the kinds of both emotional and physical violence that you've spoken about. And it does have an impact. And we certainly see it in our work looking at the experiences of religious communities. There's one video that we've used in some of our trainings where someone put on their storefront, "Muslims get out." And,
Wow.
they him, and, it was a very interesting dynamic because he had that statement on the marquee outside of his restaurant, but at the same time, when interviewed, he seemed to be, saying, "Oh, I'm not talking about, people who are not causing trouble. I'm talking about the people who are, kind of waging war against us. And it's just kind of like, but anybody passing that sign, driving by it,
Yeah.
what are they to
Right.
think? And so I do feel like there is some place for all of us to actually think about how we can be an ally, not just that there's nothing I can do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not an expert on anti-bullying resources and all of that, but I have been reading a lot of that, given what's going on. And I think there's this, there's a certain comfort that you get from closeness, right? Proximity and being with them. And, you know, just, you know, reading about, you know, how to deal with when someone's being harassed on the subway, you know, you can just kind of come close to them. You don't have to even say anything. You could maybe just ask them, you know, directions or something, but even that presence can help to remove the fear and that sense of isolation. So yeah, there's a lot that you can do, I think, from kind of proximity and closeness to, you know, being mentally supportive, right? Being that person that will accept that person unconditionally. Yeah.
That's great. So we have a little bit of time now, and I would like to open the question to field some questions. If you could please put your questions in the chat, then we will do our best to get to as many as possible. Okay, so Janet, thank you for your question. If an organization recognizes problems and is trying to heal, how can organizational regret and forgiveness be expressed? If an organization recognizes problems and is trying to heal, how can organizational regret and forgiveness be expressed?
Wow, we need to make sure we capture that question because that's so beautifully said. Beautifully said. Wow. I love that, and I love your take on it too, Mark, given what you do. I love that there's a desire for organizational regret and forgiveness because it's not common. I work a lot more with companies, right? Fortune 500 companies, startups, and mid-sized companies, and I don't see kind of whole organizations kind of coming forward with that. I do see individuals who've stepped up and who've said, you know what, you know, I messed up on that. I shouldn't have done this. You know, I want to apologize to you guys as a leader. I have a lot of learning to do. I've seen that kind of behavior, and I've encouraged that because I think there's a lot you can do to recover pains of the past if you could take the courage and humility to make that step, right? I do think organizations can do that. I think there's room for that. And if they're genuine and authentic about what they feel regret about and want to change their ways with action, I think this is where if you just ask for forgiveness and then just keep things the way they were, then everybody else is kind of wondering like, well, where's the regret, right? You know, what have you done for me lately kind of thing, right? So I do think, you know, it can't just be about talk. We have to think about how does that apology or forgiveness, asking for forgiveness, connect to behaviors or systems that you put in place to not repeat those types of mistakes in the future. So that's my thought. I don't know what you think, Mark.
Great. No, I think that you've hit all the points, and I would just say that I remember, I want to say within the last year or two, there was a company who realized that they had been, or the founders of the company had somehow been involved in the Holocaust. And so they have actually made some very significant public addresses of the acknowledgement of the history of the company, and have been in, you know, discussion and creation of how to address that, how to atone for that and not acknowledge it. So we'll dig that information up and try and share it in the resource as well. So I do think that authenticity is the best way, to your point. How does this line up with your standard operating policies, with the values of your company? This is an opportunity to step up to that. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A itself. The first question is from Shuli Zhang. How do we as an individual and a group change the racial bias? Is there any hope in this country to get rid of racial injustice? Real easy questions, Jane. Real easy.
I think we need to be running all these organizations, huh? if we could solve them. You know what? I think the best thing you can do is kind of, the thing about building people's awareness around differences and helping them be more effective and adaptive is you kind of need to go where they are and start from where they are, right? So I can't give someone who just doesn't want to be around people who are different from them, I can't give them advanced skills in cross-cultural communication. They're not ready for that, right? They need to realize that actually other people from different cultural communities and religious communities, they're people too. So they're human, and they have a lot of the similar interests and needs and behaviors as you as well. So I think I often think about, when I think about a huge challenge like that, I think about how I would start to attack it for an organization or a team. We need to figure out what are the gaps that exist for that group, team, company, or organization or individual, and then determine, once we recognize the diagnosis of sorts, how do we proceed? What do we need to work on as far as assumptions and beliefs and biases, and how do we replace with new behaviors, right? How do we enlarge the set of practices and skills that that person can practice so that that individual has more to offer and can be a more effective leader?
And I would just add to that from the work that we do. I think that we have seen an unfolding and an ongoing evolving around what we even mean by bias and racism. What are its legacy impacts as well as current impacts, and like continuing to be in the conversation around what these words mean and the totality of the impact of them, I think makes a big difference. Because it's a social construct, we have to create a new social construct in order for racism to go away. And that is gonna take a minute. I mean, I don't have any extra time since I've been sequestered in my apartment, but I do think that we are being called to consider all of these concepts, both from their historical meaning as well as their present experience. We have another question from the Q&A from Kelly Kim. Do you think affinity groups are being helpful to increase diversity and inclusion in the organization?
Can you just repeat that? I was just putting in the website to report incidents onto the chat, but can you just repeat that, Mark?
Sure. This is from Kelly Kim. Do you think affinity groups are being helpful to increase diversity and inclusion in the organization?
Thanks for that question, Kelly. My thought is that they can be, absolutely. Affinity groups, ERGs, DRGs, employee resource groups, they need to be deputized by senior leadership to accomplish things. And I think there are varying degrees of that. Often you go through stages of development with an ERG. In the beginning, you might want to just get people start to network with each other. And at some point, you need to have a little bit more of a strategy for how you're going to proceed with that, how you're going to be aligned with other things you want to do. They can be really impactful. I was on the Diversity Council, External Diversity Council for a huge global consumer products company for over 10 years. And I worked with their affinity groups quite a bit. And so there were three of us. One worked with the African American ERG, the other with the Latino. I worked with the Asian ERG. And we actually made a lot of difference with both equipping and developing the folks internally in their leadership development, but also we made a lot of connectivities to the business. And so, finding opportunities for business growth, connecting with Asian customers and markets outside of the company. There was a lot of community work we also did as well. So there's tremendous amount of impact that can be there, and the potential is great. The organization and the leadership needs to recognize that. And if you are deputized by them to make some of those things happen, I think there could be a lot that can be done. And it's just beyond dealing with bias, right? There could be a lot of business implications that could be beneficial.
That's great. That's great, Jane. Thank you so much. The only thing that I would add to that is, certainly one of the things that we see in our work around affinity groups helping to drive diversity and inclusion is that in many instances, many companies are beginning the journey around faith-based employee resource groups up to some degree. And we know that some of the longer, the ones that have been more established, like Texas Instruments, for many years, members of their faith-based DRG have partnered with HR and with talent development to recruit new people. And it becomes kind of like it opens up your pipeline a little bit to student groups if you're doing college recruitment, to those that might be religiously affiliated that you may not necessarily reach out to under normal circumstances. And also just thinking about the huge amount of intersectionality within religious diversity, that you really are simultaneously, if you will, looking at a variety of people from various religious backgrounds as well as cultural backgrounds. So I do think that there's a good bit of research that'll direct that people who are participating in faith-based employee resource groups are adding to the diversity and inclusion efforts within their companies. There was a question in the chat, not in the Q&A, about allyship, and give me a minute, I'm just trying to pull it back up. And I'm trying to scroll through and my computer is fighting me, literally. So this is from Linda Bredvik. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. You're asking about allyship and are there some key components or characteristics of allyship? We are definitely going to be sharing an article with everyone as part of the follow-up to this session. But the article is entitled Allyship and Accomplice, the What, Why, and How. And some of the general topics that I will just give you this definition, which is a highlight from the article. Allyship is an active and consistent practice of using power and privilege to achieve equity and inclusion while holding ourselves accountable to marginalized people's needs. And just as a teaser, if you will, for what should we be thinking about, allyship requires an understanding and self-awareness around power and privilege. Allyship's purpose is to achieve equity and inclusion. Allyship requires us to hold ourselves accountable to advancing marginalized people's needs. So we will be sharing that article out after the session, but I would say that we also want to bear in mind not just where we can be an ally, but where we might be being an accomplice to someone's experience of inequity or a lack of access. And so I believe that allyship can work in that way. And it was an article that I saw, and I was actually kind of really struck by the title, because as much as we talk about allyship, I don't know that we've had enough of a conversation about how we might be indirectly or unconsciously, or sometimes consciously, acting as an accomplice to someone's experience of inequity. So we will share that information out. We've got another question from Tamika Lowe. Thank you, Tamika. What are some of the impacts that you have seen allies have on underrepresented groups in the organization?
I could talk a little bit about sponsorship because they're different terms, but I think there's some overlap there as well. So oftentimes when we see ERGs and network groups of different ethnic groups and women and LGBT communities, I mean, there's so many different groups that organizations can create these affinity groups for. Often they select a sponsor, or they can select a sponsor who is of a different ethnicity or from a completely different community than what they're espousing to support, right, for that group. So for example, if you have a Black affinity group, you could have a Black leader, but you could also have a white male executive or a white female executive. You know, someone who is in a position to sponsor you, and that could be anybody, really. Someone who cares about your interests, who can advocate for you, and can speak on your behalf and has the influence to speak on your behalf. And I think it's helpful for your career, as well as I think advancing the cause of your affinity group, to not only think about people who are like you to be in that position. So I've seen a lot of variations of that work out. And I think it certainly provides learning for both sides too, right? The whole idea of cross-cultural allyship, where the people in the affinity group or the resource group are learning from that person from another background, and the person who is the ally or the sponsor is actually learning from and hearing from and being changed by the affinity group that he or she is sponsoring. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for synergy.
Thank you so much, Jane. Cal, we're going to try and get to your question really quickly, and then we are unfortunately coming to the end of our hour. Cal, you said an old saying is when white America catches a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. Your three questions are great to get to the heart, and Jane, I believe this is directed to you. Your three questions are great to get to the heart of what's happening with colleagues. However, how do you help those in dominant group memberships to push through their naivete and understand the inequity of their colleagues' experience during this pandemic?
That's such an interesting comment. You know, I was reading about this and actually have been reading a lot about how COVID-19 is impacting African-American community at greater rates than any other group for a lot of different reasons. And I think it's hitting the Latino community in a lot of different ways as well. I think data, I come from environments where if you don't measure it, if you can't prove it, people don't listen. But I know that data alone is not going to make it because, you know, you can see all the numbers in the world, and if you don't really care, you just ignore it and think something else, right? So I do think data and having organized data that makes a case and telling a story is really critical. And having, I think, groups not just from that. So, for example, if you're showing data about the African American community, having other groups and joining with them to support what you're saying, right? And creating that awareness that's broader than that community itself. I think sometimes these issues and problems and inequities stay with our communities ourselves. Like I get a ton of stuff on Asian blogs and knowledge about from the Angry Asian Man, all this kind of stuff, just because I'm interested in it. But then I'm like, I assume that people who are not Asian kind of know about it too, but they don't, right? And we often kind of talk within them ourselves, and because we have this comfortable place that we're being heard and that you understand each other. But I do think we need to communicate more of this in ways that the other groups understand to those to get heard in these different ways. And I know that's not the easy answer to your question, Cal, but I think that's the beginning of my thought around how do we start to speak into those communities that are different from us so that they'll listen, maybe one by one, or maybe subgroup by subgroup, right? Maybe by influencer to influencer or something like that. We have to kind of think about it as kind of a change process, I think. So it's my thoughts.
Thanks so much, Jane. I would just add to that, Cal, I think that what we're going to see, and this would be a place for all companies to really look into their corporate social responsibility opportunities, is how are we addressing poverty? How are we addressing the root cause of what has some people be disproportionately represented in particular groups? And I think that companies have huge and impressive ways in which they're trying to impact and provide resources for people who are poor. But there is certainly, I think, more room for that conversation as both COVID-19 and other factors continue to evolve. So we are at time. We're actually 1 minute over. I just want to thank you, Jane, so much for making time to have this conversation with us today. I want to thank all of you who joined us. We will have a recording. It may take us a minute to get it all shined up, but there will be a recording available of this conversation. And please continue to reach out to us with your questions and your comments. We are very grateful to all of you for how you share with us and let us know about the topic that you need. So if there is a topic you would like for us to consider, please let us know. That's how a lot of these interviews have been born. And thank you all for what you're doing for your colleagues and the companies that you work for in this ever-changing landscape. So I just want to thank you all. And yes, in addition, we will also be sending in our follow-up packet Jane's direct contact information. So please do reach out to her and to Hyun and Associates to speak more with her about her work. And thank you all very much. Look forward to being with you in the future.